Okay, my novel was Northern Lights, or to Americans, The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman, which is like a landmark text of speculative fiction and children's literature. So one of the things that Northern Lights is famous for is being an incredibly complex, nuanced, and like deep children's novel that can appeal to both adults and children because even though the story is like pretty fantastical and like has fantasy elements like that, the like core allegory of the story itself is super adult and really complex and actually like not particularly suited for children. So one thing that you might know about this book for is how anti-religion it is. So the main thesis of this trilogy of novels, which are called His Dark Materials, is that like in the climax of the saga, God gets like murdered basically, and it's allegorical and metaphorical, and it was attacked on a lot of fronts by like the Catholic Defense League and other like anti-Catholic defamation groups like that. But really the novel is just like it says, it's speculative fiction, and it's written just by an atheist guy who's really passionate about his beliefs towards religion. So the plot of this book is that it basically exists in a world where alternate dimensions have been already proven. Like we already understand completely, or we already are fully aware of other realities. And so our main character Lyra lives in one of those alternate realities from our own, and it's basically, in a lot of ways, they're the same. For instance, it's like basically early 20th century, like early 1900s, in her world, and she lives on the campus of Oxford College, which exists in their reality. But instead of using regular electricity in this world, the resource that they've decided to use is amber, which they can melt down and like use for fuel and such. But that's not the biggest difference between our world and theirs. The biggest difference is that every human being born in this alternate reality is born with their soul manifested outside of their body as an animal. And when you're prepubescent, that animal can change shape at will to any other animal. But then as you go through puberty, your animal settles on one form and it loses its ability to manifest and change and stuff, so it will just become one animal. So another big difference is that the geography of the world is separated differently. Like country lines are drawn differently. They have different names, things like that. Like England isn't referred to as England. It's not actually referred to anything in particular, actually. But countries like Scandinavia are called Svalbard and stuff. It's all just like redrawn distribution lines. There's three main groups of people that exist outside of humans in this world. It's witches, which are women whose demons never changed, and they were ostracized, and so they get cast out. And they're also have like witch-like abilities and stuff. In Scandinavia, the like group that rules that is like these polar bears, which can talk, and they're kind of a metaphor for industry and stuff because they're super industrious. And then there's Egyptians, which are basically like gypsies. It's like their version of like Romany culture and stuff. They live on water and such. So the way that their world in this alternate reality is ruled is that a massive overgrown version of the Catholic Church which is called the Magisterium, but it's openly also referred to as the Catholic Church or just the Church, controls the world's government, so it's a theocracy. And so instead of like scholars or scientists being the people who research things, in every single college around the world and like university and center of higher learning, in order to research other fields, you have to become a theologian first. So it's like all scientists and all scholars are theologians first and foremost, which leads to the big conflict of the novel, which is basically between freedom and slavery. And then the thing about this world is that they've discovered recently, these scientists, scholar, theologian individuals, which includes Lyra's uncle, who becomes the main character. They've discovered a new elementary particle called dust, and they've begun to observe it only settling on post-puberty humans. So they come to think that dust, this like mysterious particle, is what triggers puberty and what causes your demon, which is what your soul is called, a demon, I don't know why, to stop changing forms. And while all of this is happening in this super complex alternate reality, there's also rumors all over the world of gobblers kidnapping people's children and doing these horrible experiments to them and eating them. And Lyra eventually comes, who's the main character, eventually comes to learn that the gobblers is actually the General Oblation Board, which is a subdivision of the Catholic Church who send out people that are hired, like mercenaries, to kidnap people's children, where they're taken and experiments are performed on them in order to prevent puberty from happening. So, all of these things come to lead to the main metaphors of the novel, which is that the magisterium is evil. That's not the main metaphor, it's the main message, is that religion and all forms of organized thought like that are make slaves of the people who subscribe to it, and that kind of a idea or worldview. But the novel is basically separated into two ways that you can interpret it, which is that you can achieve freedom through sexuality or freedom through knowledge. So first we're going to go through sexuality. So since dust is what causes puberty, the church is super what it would be like anti-pleasure. They're really all about punishing yourself and not experiencing like sensuality and all those kinds of things. So they've sent out like their best theologians / scientists to discover this technique of preventing dust from entering children, I guess, and causing puberty. So that process develops and becomes intercision, which is what happens to the children who get kidnapped by the General Oblation Board, which, fun fact, the oblate, what's in the Catholic Church when you're, the people who bring the wine and the, I'm not Catholic. Yeah, that, like the oblation, it means offering, so the children are like an offering. But intercision is the process they develop, and it's what happens to the kids, and basically through this massive electric guillotine thing, the link between them and their soul gets separated, and they become like catatonic, or like basically lobotomized, but then they never go through puberty, and they can function as members of the church without any kind of sexual rebellion. So another example of freedom through sexuality in the novel is that the witches, so the witch population that lives in the north are all female. There's no male influence in them. If a male is born to one of them, then they're cast out and not like added to the society. So the witches lived in a time where there was no church because they're really old, and so they have no concept of the kind of controls and restrictions and stuff that the church puts on the people that it governs. And they're very anti-religion and anti-magisterium. So they basically represent an idealized form of where you wouldn't have ever had a oppressive influence over you to repress your sexuality, or to stop your ability to access knowledge, because that's the other main focus of the novel, is that you can achieve freedom through knowledge, and that the repression of knowledge is always evil, which is what the magisterium is involving itself in. So, first example of like the fact that obviously freedom through knowledge can't be achieved in this society is that the scholars are all theologians first and foremost. So they have no lens beyond the Catholic lens to view the world, which leads to a lot of misuse of scientific information and stuff, and unethical scientific behavior, which is motivated by a religious perspective, such as intercision, which is like super unethical and damaging and all these things. Again, knowledge or dust doesn't only function as a metaphor for sexuality because of puberty, it also doubles as a metaphor for knowledge because, as we all know, Adam and Eve ate of the apple of the fruit of knowledge, or ate of the apple of the tree of knowledge, and they realized their nakedness, which has like the double metaphor of being both knowledge and sexuality, because then they were ashamed of their sex and they had to hide it. And then finally, Lyra's childhood friend, Ravi, was kidnapped by the General Oblation Board early in the novel, and after the whole course of events of the first novel, he's finally free and rescued, but Lyra's uncle, Lord Azrael, who's a scholar, theologian, but he's super anti-religion and anti-magisterium, and who's been doing guerrilla work trying to undermine the church's teachings all over the world. He kidnaps Robert and sacrifices him and throws him through a rip in dimensions into our world, and it's basically supposed to represent like God sacrificing Jesus. And so Pullman is like highlighting the foolishness of believing in something like that. I'm not particularly preaching my religious views, but the author of this novel is super anti-religion, so that's how the knowledge and the sexuality and the religion all come together to form one of my favorite books. That was Golden Compass by Philip Pullman.